We are live. Welcome, everyone. This is the New York Ghost Story Festival. It is December 15th, 2022. This is year 3 of the festival. It's a cold day in New York. I'm here with Kathe Koja, Jeff Ford, and Ian Rogers, and very, very excited about that. Happy to be here. And I'm your host, Daniel Braum. Welcome, everyone. And welcome and thank you for joining us for Ghost Stories. We're going to get right to it. I'm going to introduce our first ghost story reader. Kathe Koja writes novels and short fiction and creates and directs and produces immersive events. Her work has been multiply translated, optioned for film, and won awards, including the Bram Stoker Award, the ASBCA Henry Berg Award, Gustav Myers Award, the Locus Award, the Spectrum Award, the Parents' Choice Award, and ALA Best Book for Young Adults. She was a finalist for the Philip K. Dick Award and World Fantasy Award. Her most recent project is Dark Factory from Meerkat Press, and I think coming soon, is it Dark Park is coming next?
Dark Park.
Exciting stuff. Welcome, Kathe, and you've got some seasonal poems to start this year's festival off with it. I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm really excited to be reading ghost poetry because that's one of the great underrepresented gifts of this season, of the early darkness and the feeling of change in the wind. And the poems that I've chosen to read tonight all have a meaning and they all string together. And the first one is from a book that I had as a very little girl. And poetry is what taught me to love and understand rhythm in speech and meter and how words go together and how they create feelings and velocity. And so the poem that I've chosen to start with is an oldie but a goodie. It's called The Highwaymen by Alfred Noyes. And this poem has been read around firesides for a long minute. The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight across the purple moor, and the highwaymen came riding. The highwaymen came riding up to the old inn door. He'd a French cocked hat on his forehead, a bunch of lace at his chin, a coat of the claret velvet, and breeches of brown doeskin. They fitted with never a wrinkle. His boots were up to the thigh. And he rode with a jeweled twinkle, his pistol butts a twinkle, his rapier hilt a twinkle, under the jeweled sky. Over the cobbles he clattered and clashed in the dark inn yard, and he tapped with his whip on the shutters, but all was locked and barred. He whistled a tune to the window, and who should be waiting there but the landlord's black-eyed daughter, Bess, the landlord's daughter, plaiting a dark red love knot in her long black hair. And dark, in the dark old inn yard, a stable wicket creaked, where Tim, the ostler, listened. His face was white and peaked. His eyes were hollows of madness, his hair like moldy hay. But he loved the landlord's daughter, the landlord's red-lipped daughter. Dumb as a dog he listened, and he heard the robber say, "One kiss, my bonny sweetheart, I'm after a prize tonight. But I shall be back with the yellow gold before the morning light. Yet if they press me sharply and harry me through the day, then look for me by moonlight, watch for me by moonlight. I'll come to thee by moonlight, though hell should bar it away." He rose upright in the stirrups. He scarce could reach her hand, but she loosened her hair at the casement. His face burnt like a brand as the black cascade of perfume came tumbling over his breast, and he kissed its waves in the moonlight. Oh, sweet black waves in the moonlight. Then he tugged at his reins in the moonlight and galloped away to the west. He did not come in the dawning. He did not come at noon. And out of the tawny sunset, before the rise of the moon, when the road was a gypsy's ribbon looping the purple moor, a redcoat troop came marching. marching. King George's men came marching up to the old inn door. They said no word to the landlord. They drank his ale instead. But they gagged his daughter and bound her to the foot of her narrow bed. Two of them knelt at her casement with muskets at the side. There was death at every window and hell at one dark window, for Bess could see through her casement the road that he would ride. They had tied her up to attention with many a sniggering jest. They had bound a musket beside her with the barrel beneath her breast. Now keep good watch, and they kissed her. She heard the dead man say, look for me by moonlight, watch for me by moonlight. I'll come to thee by moonlight, though hell should bar the way. She twisted her hands behind her, but all the knots held good. She writhed her hands till her fingers were wet with sweat or blood. They stretched and strained in the darkness, and the hours crawled by like years. Till now, on the stroke of midnight, cold on the stroke of midnight, the tip of one finger touched it. The trigger at last was hers. The tip of one finger touched it. She strove no more for the rest. Up she stood to attention, with the barrel beneath her breast. She would not risk their hearing. She would not strive again, for the road lay bare in the moonlight, blank and bare in the moonlight, and the blood of her veins in the moonlight throbbed to her love's refrain. Had they heard it? The horse hoofs ringing clear? In the distance, were they deaf that they did not hear? Down the ribbon of moonlight, over the brow of the hill, the highwaymen came riding, riding, riding. The redcoats looked to their priming. She stood up straight and still. In the frosty silence, in the echoing night, nearer he came and nearer. Her face was like a light. Her eyes grew wide for a moment. She drew one last deep breath. Then her finger moved in the moonlight. The musket shattered the moonlight, shattered her breast in the moonlight, and warned him with her death. He turned. He spurred him westward. He did not know who stood, bowed with her head o'er the musket, drenched with her own red blood. Not till the dawn he heard it, and slowly blanched to hear how Bess, the landlord's daughter, the landlord's black-eyed daughter, had watched for her love in the moonlight and died in the darkness there. Back he spurred like a madman, shrieking a curse to the sky, with the right road smoking behind him and his rapier brandished high. Blood red were his spurs in the golden noon, wine red was his velvet coat, when they shot him down on the highway, down like a dog on the highway, and he lay in his blood on the highway, with a bunch of lace at his throat. And still, of a winter's night, they say, when the wind is in the trees, when the moon is a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas, when the road is a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, a highwayman comes riding, 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 a highwayman comes riding up to the old inn door. Over the cobbles he clatters and clangs in the dark inn yard, and he taps with his whip on the shutters, but all is locked and barred. He whistles a tune to the window, and who should be waiting there but the landlord's black-eyed daughter, Bess, the landlord's daughter, plaiting a dark red love knot in her long black hair. If you could do it better than that. That's a poem that has stayed with me my whole life, because it has everything. It has velocity, it has a story, it has death and blood and love and eternity. And I'm very happy to have read it for you tonight. The next poem that I chose is from a book collected by a man called Richard Lewis. I know nothing about this book. I know nothing about any of these poems, but it's called Miracles, Poems by Children of the English-Speaking World. And it really is a miracle. The poems in here are from children as young as 5 and as old as 13. And the one that I'm reading is by a young girl. Her name was Diane Hill, age 11, from England. And that's all the info we have. But her poem says, and it's untitled, slowly melting, slowly dying, my heart drops with the drips. The long finger of ice stretches out, and its tears roll off its tip. 11 years old. She was the kind of little girl that I wanted to be. I wanted to be a little poem reading girl. And I did write poetry. It's all very bad. It's been long burned, so no one will ever see it. But I continued to write, and I continued to love velocity in stories, and to love that rhythm, and to love the way words go together. And even though it is not poetry, I chose to read a section from a short story collection of mine called Velocities. It's from a story called Velocity. And we come into the midst of an interview with an artist who believes with everything in him that his dead and hateful father is haunting the house in which he lives, the family home, where he has very unwisely come back to create his art. And in this story, this is before the days of mobile phones. So a phone in the house is still a thing, and it's definitely a thing to him. And he says to the interviewer, when I was working on Acrimony, my show Acrimony, I kept getting these phone calls. At first I thought it was just crank stuff, some dumb shit breathing on the phone. Once or twice I even talked to him, just, you having fun, asshole? Mary, the gallery director, Mary said it was creepy and that I ought to call the cops, but I didn't. Thought it was kind of funny. But then he started calling me at home. You were staying at home at the Red House. The number is unlisted. There's no phones in the house, no phone jacks even. But I'd hear it ring and ring and ring. It'd go on for fucking hours. Sometimes I'd go sit outside just to get away from the sound. Sometimes I'd sleep outside. Then I started sleeping at the gallery in Mary's office, and that helped. You should see your face. You look like the cat that just ate shit. Anyway, when I finally got the show up, the call stopped. Like he was trying to fuck me over, right? Get me to stop working. Who was trying? Who do you think? Mary said I was working too hard, or taking too much speed. Well, wait, erase that. But if it was the speed, then how come I never heard it unless I was working? The phone and the knocking on the windows. I had them come and trim the branches, just hack them away from the house. I mean, I knew what it was, but I wanted to be sure, right? And I was right. It wasn't trees or shrubs or branches. It was goddamn knocking, and it was him. Just like the phone was him, just like the guy at the bike shop, the one I always use, right? Now he won't sell me any more bikes. He says it's too dangerous. Dangerous. To him, he means. Because he knows. Because he gets into people's heads like poison gas or something, like he did to my mother. I watched him do it. She was so. And then he killed her. I know it was him. There's no way that barn burned by itself. And he got Teo too. Who is Teo? Her horse. They found them together. She was all. Then he tried to do it to me in Sedona, Berlin, where the fuck ever. Doesn't matter, never did. You think being dead is a problem for him? It just makes it easier. It just makes everything easier. Mr. Vukovich, when you were working on, don't change the subject. Don't change the subject. You said you wanted to talk about him. Well, that's what we're talking about. Are you afraid? Is that it? Speak of the devil and the devil appears. But he's already here. He's already right here. And we give the last word, as is fitting, to the Queen, who tells us, one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, than its interior confronting that cooler host. Far safer through an abbey gallop, the stones a chase, than unarmed, one's own self encounter in lonesome place. Ourself behind ourself, concealed, should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment, be horror's least. The body borrows a revolver. He bolts the door, or looking a superior specter, or more.
Wow.
Thank you.
Nice.
Kathe, that was so great. Thank you so much. I hope I wasn't distracting you while you were reading. I was putting little comments from our friends and colleagues who are here in the sidebar chat. And I was prepared. I had a couple of questions, a couple of notes that I scribbled down that I was going to ask you. But that was so great. It all just went out the window because I just came up with new stuff as I'm listening. I'm like, oh. But you started off by saying, so first of all, thanks for getting the season started with those fantastic renditions of our favorite poems and some new poems that are absolutely great. On the subject of poetry, one of the first things you said that poems was your way in to writing, and what you think you said, the rhythm and velocity, and I love that word velocity. You said the rhythm and velocity was like your gateway into choosing the images that communicate. Tell then the name of your short story is Velocity, and that just dovetails with a bunch of things that I think are going to come up with the show. Yeah, tell me about that. Tell me about the velocity of words and the transfer of images from writer to reader.
I think the reason that we love poetry and we remember things in poetry and in song too, far more easily than we do text, because it's speaking to us on several different levels and in several different ways, and it's indelible, sometimes in a way plain text is not. Knowing that words, that meter exists and that rhythm exists in writing was a huge influence on me. And once I understood that was a thing, I mean, think of Dr. Seuss, right? I mean, think of the way those words go together and the way they connect. It's not only the images, it's the way the words go together. And
it's magic. It just seems like
really is magic. I think, this is literally my little golden book of poetry. This shit has been taken together so many times because I've read this and read this and read this. And not every poem in it was something that spoke to me, but I learned from everything. And I learned that there is an intrinsic rhythm in story. That's why Emily Dickinson has always been my queen. And Emily is just the queen of not even minimalism. I mean, she can knock you across the room. with us.
Speaking of meter and about how
Pooh.
words being said, this might be comical, but it sort of is comical, but it sort of isn't. A long time ago, I once heard Carlos Santana talk about his phrasing and his guitar things, and he was saying when an interviewer asked him about his leads and his guitar phrasing, he said, "Oh, I create these little angels on my guitar and I send them out and I send them over to you and I put them in your brain." And I'm like, "Oh man, Carlos, you are really high, or you're really on that metaphysical thing." But kind of not, right? That's also
Kind of not.
it's also
Kind of
writing
not.
it. That kind of is a thing there. I have everyone's mics on, and I have a question I'm going to ask you first, and then throw it over to the panel. But I want to stay on the poetry for 1 or 2 more seconds, because you said that when you were talking about how you wanted to be that little girl who wrote poems, and you wrote poems and you burnt them all up, and so they don't exist. But I just was thinking, like, I don't know, are any of those burnt up poems in some Neil Gaiman-esque imagined library of burnt poems, or somewhere that that can be retrieved? That's not. That's
I
not.
will never know because I will never look. So I don't know. But I think
Something.
it was, I think because the same way that children have an affinity for animals, we have an affinity when we're young for poetry for a very specific reason, because it's the kind of writing that speaks to us on multiple levels, and we could take it in on multiple levels. And
Mhm.
you can delight a room full of children with poetry in a way that prose is just not going to be the same. It will not hit the same receptors. So, but as a little reader girl, I don't know that anything helped me more to become a writer than poetry.
Speaking of those receptors, I want to throw this question out to everyone, but I want to mention who you said, the Queen, Emily Dickinson. You started right out in that poem, and it said, I forget the exact line, but it was like, "One not need be a house to be haunted." And let's just put a tag on that,
Right.
and we're gonna come back. We're gonna come back to that. But here's a question for you, and then let's have the panel hit it. Speaking of those receptors, speaking of that velocity that hits children or that hits us, what is the appeal of these ghost stories? And taking it one step further, why is this time of year around fires, as you said, Kathe? What's the appeal of the ghost story, and why is this time of year even more appealing for them?
I think because part of us still feels that memory of being around those fires and being in those places where the dark held so much more than we could imagine. And so maybe our imagination was also kind of a way to manage the darkness, to kind of name or to suggest what might be out there. And maybe we could come to grips with it, or maybe not. But the thing named is not as frightful.
Yeah, over to Ian and Jeff. Jump on in.
Yeah, eh, writing is telepathy. You know, you're writing something down, you're trying to transfer it to someone else's mind, and with poetry, you're going right for the heart. You know, I mean, you could have a story that you just really enjoy, but it doesn't make you feel anything. But poetry is written in the language of the soul. I mean, it's designed to get an emotional response, and I think, especially the poems that Kathe read, specifically about this time of year as well. You know, Christmas. There's an intimacy to this time. There's a reflection. It's the end of the year. It's about time passing. There's reflection, and I mean, there's a reason why season affective disorder affects people at this time of year. It's a reflection. It's not something that's not always a positive reflection. You think about your life. You think about your death, maybe mortality. I think it's just a season that really lends itself to that, and we don't want to turn away from it. You know, a lot of us really sort of want to indulge it. We want to sort of explore the dark side because you have to. You know, you can't have the light without the dark, and there are unanswered questions. You know, the light doesn't ask anything from you. You know, but the dark, we're constantly wondering, like, what's it going to be like? What are the things we need answers? You know, so I think we write these things and we read these things because we're looking for some sort of truth, or at the very least, some sort of reassurance that it's going to be okay. You know.
Oh wow, I love that line. The light doesn't ask anything of you. I'm going to say that a couple of times this year. I think that's good. Yeah, Jeff, what's the appeal of ghost stories for you?
At this time of year, I think I think people forget that Christmas is a pagan holiday.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And those cultures that were up in the northern part of Europe and so forth that gave rise to it, they were ancestor worshippers. And so they wanted the entire family strength from the entire history of the family around at certain festival times. Um, that's why I think ghost stories are still important. If you notice, like the way that the Catholic Church, that the Vatican got to inculcate those peoples in the northern part of Europe was they invented purgatory.
Mhm.
And so it was a place for your relatives, your these ancestors to be that wasn't hell. You know what I mean? That wasn't the total afterlife. So it was a great PR job because the thing is like the more they prayed, the more that the people prayed, the closer their ancestors got into to heaven, and the more they became inculcated into the religion.
Mhm.
You know, so if you notice in the ancient world, in ancient literature, like say the Odyssey and things like that, maybe in Gilgamesh, they talk to people in the underworld, but they're not really ghosts. It's only with the rise of purgatory and the cross section with that and these ancestor worshiping cultures that ghosts really hit the big time in
Mhm.
northern European households and stuff. But it has to do with these festival days throughout the year. Um, you know, Christmas and Halloween and these things that are these pagan holidays. I think anyway. I could be wrong. I don't know.
Mhm.
Jeff, you never cease to surprise me. I mean, that was just a really, that was like not to say it like a dirty word, but that was an intellectual answer. And I was just reading. I'm going to ask you some questions about intuition and some of your quotes of anti-intellectualism and how you're the man who I think of when I think of intuition, and I'm just like Jeff's got the intellectual answer going on. Always surprising me in the best of ways.
Well, yeah, I agree with Kathy that the rhythm of words. I remember Lucius Shepard telling me like
Oh,
you either have to have a hook to get them into the story, or if you have the right flow of language,
Mhm.
you can go a long way with that before you have to do anything in the piece
Right.
because you have one approach or the other. But that's one of the
mm,
reasons why I learned it's important to know grammar
Mhm.
because you want to be able to be a master of the manipulation of sentence structures so that you don't always have that same subject verb incantatory rhythm,
Mhm.
so that you can change different parts words. You know what a gerund phrase is and a prepositional phrase and all that. And you can manipulate sentence structures to capture the authorial voice that you find necessary to tell that story.
Mhm.
and when Jeff talks about master of grammar, he doesn't use it lightly. It's easy to forget because I'm a student. I've been a longtime fan of Jeff's work, and more recently I had the opportunity to be a student, and he makes it look easy. And I think he's just internalized so many of these lessons. But as a student, just when you think Jeff's doing it by magic, he'll put his. I remember one of your exercises. He put a sentence on the board, and you were just playing with how far pushing the class to manipulate the sentence while have it still be grammatically correct.
Mhm.
And it was astounding. It was
Well, I'm
astounding.
not really a master of this. I didn't even know any of this when I went to graduate school, but teaching composition was where I learned it. You know what I mean? Trying to get other people to to see that the sentence isn't so rigid and that that there's possible myriad possible ways that it could be said or written and stuff, and to find the one that matches their voice. So I'm no master at it, but I notice it. I mean, I recognize it, the fact that that's the case.
Well, I think when we talk about a story hooking us and drawing us in, what we're really saying is that it's also written well. I mean,
Right.
because let's face it, you could have a great story, but if it's not written well, it's a bumpy road. And I might stick with it for a little while if I'm really enjoying a part of it. But when a story flows, it's the prose. And ironically, because we were chatting a bit last night, I picked up off my shelf the Cipher, Kathy's book, and I was going to say you could, I was just start reading the first page, but really you could open it to any page in that. And I mean, Kathe's prose is just, it's beautiful. It's just, I think it's something that Kathe is really well known for just in general as an author. But when I was picking up the cipher, it was just one that was like, yep, still got it. It's just, I mean, not still got, I mean, it's 1991, I believe, but it was the one that really,
It
said,
still holds.
I need to buy everything that she publishes. It's just so good.
While we're talking about buying everything from Kathe, I think this is a great time. Right before my next question I just want to hold up. This is one from me. Let's see if I can get it straight. This one's from Meerkat Press, Velocities, and it's the title story was what we heard a little bit from Velocity, and I think it was originally published in a great book of ghost stories, new ghost stories called The Dark from Ellen Datlow. We're going to be talking about some Ellen Datlow books over the festival for sure, but talking about Velocity, which we heard a little bit from for a second. It's a great and unique haunted house story. So the question is over to Kathe before we're going to hear from Ian. But Kathe, why is the haunted house story so it's so closely associated with the ghost story, and why does it lend itself to all the different kinds, from just like the classic Hammer horror, creepy haunted house, to like the murder house, to stories like Velocity, and how does the house come into play, and how did you use it in your story?
In Velocity, the idea of home is poison for this guy, because his father has poisoned his life with his escalating narcissism. And the house itself it's an architectural gem. People come and take tours with it, and they call it the Red House because at almanac sunset, if the sun is out, the house turns red. And so this is kind of the idea of the house as heart, or the house, the heart of the home is the family, and his family has been murdered, basically. The mother is dead. He is being driven over the edge. And home is supposed to be the place that you can expect safety and nurturing when you go home. The world may be terrible, but you come home and it's the place where they have to take you in. It's a place where people are on your side and there to care for your welfare. And there is no more savage haunting than disordered and murderous home. There is no safety then. And that idea of whether this thing is actually happening to this man or not, it's happening to him. It is happening, whether it is happening in the real world or not, it is happening. And the way he is meeting it is the horror, right? Is being trapped in, he need not be in that house at all. He should probably go thousands of miles away from it, right? And then burn it down and sow the ground with salt. But he's there. He chose to go there. So that is the horror.
How to end every horror story, right? Like by Eddie Murphy. Like, get out of the house. Okay. End of story. Yeah.
Nope. Yeah, just nope, right out.
But it's no laughing matter. I mean, I also love what you say about how how do you put it? It's happening whether it's happening or not is just brilliant. And I love that about that story, and I love that about ghost stories, and I love that about stories in general. Thank you so much for kicking it off, Kathe. We're gonna be talking more about haunted houses tonight, so stay tuned as I introduce our next guest. Ian Rogers is the author of the award-winning collection, aptly titled "Every House is Haunted." A novelette from the collection, "The House on Ashley Avenue," was a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Award, and is the basis for a potentially upcoming Netflix project produced by Sam Raimi. Ian lives with his wife in Peterborough, Ontario. Welcome, Ian. We're going to turn it over to you, and I think we're going to be hearing a story from Every House is Haunted, I believe we're going to be hearing from The Candle.
That's right. Candle is the last story in the collection. It's one I like to read at events. It's short, so I can usually read the whole thing, and I think it's sort of evocative of all the work that I try and do, kind of like a what Charles L. Grant called quiet horror. Sort of more supernatural fiction, ghost stories, as opposed to a lot of blood and guts. Although I'm not averse to writing that stuff as well too. But this one, especially for the theme tonight, I thought was a good one to read. It's a kind of a subtle ghost story, supernatural story. It's I think what we were talking earlier about why it's such a good time of year to tell these types of stories. It's The Candle is about time passing and like a quiet reflection, and the way that you can be haunted by the past and haunted by the future because you still don't know what's coming. It doesn't matter how old you are, how experienced you are, how smart you become. You don't know what's going to happen, and in ways, I think that's one of the scariest things of all. Regardless of all the ghosts and hauntings that may or may not exist in the world. So yeah, all right. So The Candle. Did you blow out the candle? Tom lowered his book and turned toward Peggy. Peggy lowered her own book and bit her lower lip. Why was it that she could remember what she had for breakfast every day this week? Could even remember what she was wearing on most of those days, but couldn't remember if she had blown out the candle in the living room. Is this what middle age is? She wondered. The loss of short-term memory? She hoped not. She was forgetful enough as it was. She didn't need to help it along. Yes, she said finally. Then, no. I don't know. Peggy watched as Tom laid his hand on top of his book. She noticed the wrinkles on his fingers, the white hairs on his knuckles, and thought, we've gotten old. How did this happen? He looked at her fully now. Well, he said, which is it? Huh? She looked at him quizzically. Her own book had slumped forward and was now lying open on her chest. I'm sorry, Tom, I must be sleepier than I thought. What did you say? I asked if you remembered to blow out the candle. He was getting impatient. In the living room? She bit her lip again, and Tom had to repress an urge, one that had becoming stronger over the 26 years of their marriage, to reach out and pull her lip from under her perfectly capped teeth. It drove him crazy. Biting her lip while she was trying to remember something was one of her half-dozen or so little gestures. It was enough to drive a man nuts. I really can't recall, Peggy said at last. I remember lighting it, of course, because the window was open and the smell of oats was really strong tonight. And I remember turning off the lamp after the movie was over. You put the DVD back on the shelf and I picked up the glasses on the coffee table. She trailed off, lost in thought. But I don't remember if I blew out that darn candle. Well, can you go check? Why can't you go? She asked a little testily. Because you lit the damn thing, Tom replied, a little testily himself. Because I lit it? Peggy repeated. What are you, 6 years old? Are you? He shot back. What is it? Are you afraid to go into the living room in the dark? Are you? I'm already comfortable. Then, as if to accentuate this fact, Tom nestled a bit further down under the covers and picked up his book again. I'm comfortable too, Peggy replied, a bit indignantly. She opened her own book as if she was deeply engrossed in it. A tight little frown squiggled on her face. Tom heaved a big sigh. Listen, Peg, I've gotten up twice already. Once to make sure the side door was closed and locked, because you couldn't remember if you did that, and again to feed the stupid cat. Peggy looked at him and decided it was probably easier to submit now than to continue arguing about it. On the day she married Tom, her mother had given Peggy 2 pieces of advice. Don't sign anything until your lawyers looked at it first, and never go to bed angry. Okay, she said, closing her book and putting it on the nightstand. But this means you're making breakfast in the morning. Blueberry pancakes, she added. From behind his book, Tom snorted good-naturedly to show that he was a good sport, that bygones were bygones. Peggy flipped back the coverlet and slid her long legs out of bed. She was quite tall, taller even than Tom's considerable 5 feet 10 inches, and while she had always taken pride in her long legs, she didn't much like looking at them anymore. Like Tom's hands, they were starting to show their years. Not that it mattered. Her legs had the years and the mileage. When the floor creaked under her feet, she thought that part of the sound, surely not the greater part, but some part at least, was the joints in her knees letting her know that her days of junior varsity soccer and ringette were over. Long over. She pulled up the baggy cotton boxer shorts she was wearing, the ones with the Peterborough Pete's logo on them, and reflected that her days of sexy lace underwear from IC France, the lingerie store downtown, were over too. This is where I ended up, she thought as she ambled out into the dark hallway. This is where life has taken me. It wasn't as bad as she made it out. She had a satisfying marriage to a man she was still in love with. They had no major financial concerns, and they were both healthy. There were no kids because they had planned to wait until Tom's first novel put them on Easy Street. And when it didn't, they decided that the window had passed, and really, would it be such a tragedy if they didn't have kids? They had a house that was paid for, a car that was only 3 years old, and a large nest egg for their steadily approaching retirement. All of these things have brought me here, she thought, walking down a dark hallway to the living room, where they had watched a lot of movies but not much living really took place. Tom tried to get back into his book, but he couldn't concentrate. He was distracted by vague feelings of guilt. He felt a bit like a guy who had taken a girl out on a date, then told her no, he wouldn't walk her home, even though it was dark out. Like a bit of a louse, if he was perfectly honest. But it was just their living room, he reasoned. Nothing scary about that. He listened for Peggy's footsteps, which should have been audible on the old hardwood floors, but he didn't hear anything. All of this over a stupid candle. Peggy? The house was an old colonial, and even the cat, who weighed a whopping 7 pounds, made the boards creak and pop as he patted around. It was not a house where you could sneak up on someone undetected. They could hear you coming a mile away. It had even gotten so he could tell, just by the different groans and creaks, exactly where someone was headed, from the living room to the kitchen, from the bedroom to the bathroom. The sounds had become as much a part of the house as the smell of oats from the Quaker factory across the river that wafted in through the open windows when the wind was blowing right. From where he was lying in bed, he could see only a small sliver of hallway through the open doorway. The bedroom was located at the very back of the house. The living room was at the front. He looked over at the clock on the nightstand and tried to figure out how long she'd been gone. 2 minutes? 3? Surely not as long as 5 minutes. Long enough, he figured, to walk into the living room, check to see if the candle was still burning, and if it was, blow it out. Peg? No reply. She's screwing with me, he thought. She's not answering because she's pissed off. Soon he'd hear the creaking floorboards, and she'd stroll into the room and slip back under the covers as if nothing was wrong. Fine, let her be that way. Two can play that game. He picked up his book again. He tried to read. 30 seconds passed. It felt like 30 minutes. Tom closed his book with a clapping sound that seemed extraordinarily loud in the silent room. Silent house, he corrected. Why is it so quiet? He was so distracted that he had forgotten to put in his bookmark. He swore under his breath and jerked back the covers. He was sliding out of bed when he heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a woman screaming. His first panicked thought was that it was Peggy. That's why she hadn't answered him. Something was wrong. Had someone broke in? His guilt was no longer vague. It was as solid as the obstruction that had formed in his own throat and kept him from calling out. But the scream hadn't come from the house. No, he was sure of that. Tom's gaze flicked toward the bedroom window. It had come from outside. It wasn't Peggy, he told himself, assured himself. It was someone in the house next door, or maybe even from one of the houses further down the street. It had certainly been loud enough, but it was muffled too. That's because it came from inside one of the houses, not from someone on the street. He didn't know how he knew that, but he did. He climbed out of bed and walked over to the doorway. Peg, where are you? Nothing. He stepped into the hallway and out of the glow thrown by the bedside lamps. He was alone in the darkness. The smell of roasting oats was very strong. It was not an unpleasant smell, but it was the one that had gotten old very quickly. His stomach made a protesting, groaning sound. He walked into the darkened living room, the hardwood floor popping and creaking under his bare feet. He moved past the dining room table, the futon they had bought for guests to sleep on because they didn't have another bedroom. The shapes of the couch and the love seat were limned against the orange glow of the streetlights. He saw the candle, a smaller silhouette on one of the end tables. It was out. There was no sign of Peggy. He started to turn around to search the rest of the house when he suddenly realized the room wasn't empty. Someone was sitting in the old wicker rocking chair, which was no longer in the corner of the room, but in front of the wide bay window that looked out on McDonald Street. He was straining his eyes to see who it was when the candle on the end table suddenly flickered into low-burning life. Tom's eyes were drawn to it instinctively. His mouth fell open. In the dim light, he saw it was Peggy sitting in the chair. It rocked forward and Tom jerked backward. He didn't scream. Not like the woman next door, he thought randomly. What had that woman seen? Her husband, maybe? Sprawled out in his favorite recliner? What had he gotten up to do? Check to make sure the front door was locked? Bring in the dog? A cold sheen of sweat formed on his back. His pajama top clung to him like a greasy second skin. Peggy began to speak, but not in any tone Tom had ever heard in all the years he had known her. No questions, my sweet, Peggy said in a sharp, clear voice. No questions tonight. Just the answer. Your answer. What in the hell is going on? He thought frantically. The candle flickered and Tom glanced at it again. A smell wafted over to him. It was a sweet smell, a ripe smell that he couldn't identify. It didn't make any sense. The candle was vanilla scented. It was a smell he and Peggy both enjoyed, along with autumn spice, apple pie, and desert rose. A smell that had filled the room earlier that evening. Something was wrong. Peggy was staring at the candle too. He had seen her profile 1,000 times over the years, 100,000 times, and he knew it as well as his own reflection. But there was something different about it now. Different in the same subtle way that the smell of the candle was different. It was clearly Peggy sitting in the rocker, and yet it wasn't. Something was missing, or something had been added. Something that changed her entirely and made her a stranger. Tom jumped as another scream split the night. Was it someone else making a similar discovery? Was it someone he and Peggy knew? Someone in their circle of friends? Someone, maybe, who had spent the night on their futon? He had sent his wife out here to do something. Now he bent over to do it himself. He felt Peggy's eyes watching him. He could feel them crawling on his skin like beetles. His eyes looked up at the window, and from this angle he could see the moon. It was different too. The shape was right, but the color was all wrong. Tom took 2 deep breaths, one to steady himself and one to do what needed to be done. Just pretend it's your birthday, he told himself. Peggy whispered, "Make a wish." He blew out the candle.
Thank you so much
Terrific.
for that reading. I'm so what a great choice, Ian. What a great story. I have a lot to say about it. First of all, it goes really great with the other 2 great stories that we've heard from or we're going to hear from tonight. So thank you just for instinctively coming up with that. And you mentioned Charles Grant and quiet horror, and that's just there are so many different kinds of horror and kinds of ghost stories, and that's just really the kind of story that goes well with the kind of stories I like to investigate and think about in this festival. Particularly like, it goes really well with like a Steve Renzik-Tem story and his kind of approach. And the third thing I want to say is what a bold, it's a quiet horror, but what a bold stroke to end your collection on just such a subtle bit of quiet horror. And like you said, in the way you introduced it, you said there are all different kinds of hauntings, and even being haunted by the future. And I was thinking of this story and of Jeff's, of course, when Kathe was saying that bit that I put my finger on Emily Dickinson. One need not be a house to be haunted. So, but saying that, I just want to take this opportunity to hold up. Here's a digital picture of my ebook of every house is haunted. This is the ebook. It's got such a cool cover to it. This is the reissue of your collection from Cemetery Dance. It's a great title. It's an apt title, but tell us about the title and and beyond the literal in there, and how it relates to the stories and the kinds of stories, the ghost stories that we're going to see in your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when I came up with the title, I wasn't really trying to think of something that would be clever. It was my first collection, and the stories were all supernatural to some degree or another. But what I realized when I was looking at them, the ones that I wanted in this book, is that they were about haunted places, but they're also about haunted people. And I realized that every house being haunted was really just about being haunted by different things, whether it's trauma or memories, or I even wanted to look at others, people that are haunted by happiness, people that have, I mean, for writers, it's, we were talking about it the other day, imposter syndrome, it's just like, you can't be happy, it's like, you can be haunted by happiness. It's just like, things can feel too good to be true. And I can't think of anything else that is more of a subtle haunting. And those are the creepiest ones, when you don't even know you're being haunted. It's one thing for a Ghostbuster to go in a house with their little EMF detector and say, hey, this is where the cold spot is. But I think there's something else where you could have almost like a horror movie version of The Matrix, and you wake up and you realize that your happy life is not real. Like, it's just, you are living, actually in a nightmare. It's I think that's even more terrifying, because I think us as humans, we sort of define ourselves on the negativity sometimes, we're not allowed to be happy. We look for flaws. We're very suspicious of those types of things. So when I did this collection, I really wanted to go beyond the obvious supernatural elements and really explore the people. Because I think, I mean, if you don't have good characters, you don't have anything. If people aren't going to follow your characters through your stories to find out what happens to them, they're not going to care about anything. So even in a short story where you're only spending a very brief amount of time with these characters, I think they still have to matter on some level. They don't have to be necessarily sympathetic characters, but you still have to be invested enough to follow them through to the end of the story. So yeah, I didn't want to do a whole book of haunted house stories. I didn't want to do 22 haunted house stories, but even with different twists on them, I feel like would get pretty old after a while. But you would be surprised by there's definitely a couple of Amazon reviews out there that said, "Hey, all 22 of these stories aren't haunted houses. What's going on here? Want my money back?"
Hey, people love them. People love them. Right, and as much as I love them, as much as I love the first position or the classic form, right? I love the ghost stories, but I love the kind that you just described, possibly even more, right? Where it's about something else as well. I'm going to open it up to the panel after throwing this next question at you. Yeah, like stories like The Candle that you read. I love the story. It's a modern story in that it's a ghost story that's a very human story. I think maybe it was Steve Tem who said it, or Jeff said it about where you're relating to your title. I think you don't need a house to be haunted to have a haunting, and right. It sounds sort of clever, but it's just such an inroad into a type of ghost story.
You don't need a ghost, really. All you do need is a haunting for a ghost story. You don't need a ghost.
Well, even the people in this
haunting will do.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote this one, I mean, we always say like home is where the heart is, but home is where the haunts are too, And it's just like, for me, it was like everything in this story was real. Like, this was the house was real. My wife and I lived in that house when we first moved to Peterborough. It was the first floor of a century house that we lived in. Everything in that story is real except the couple. The couple is not us at all. But the details, the Quaker factory across the river, you would smell this wonderful smell of roasting oats. So I just really wanted to sort of take that and turn it on its head and see what I could do to, because I was really happy. I was happy to live in Peterborough. I'm happy being married to my wife, but I'm a horror guy. So I wanted to say, well, what if I just drag this into a nightmare and make it really awful? So, but in a very subtle way. The way that I think you really go for the heart is you have to make it heartfelt, So I really wanted you to know these people and to sort of be pulling for them. And even by the end of it, it's sort of mysterious about what's even happening, much less what's going to happen to them. Even I'm not even sure, and that's why I stopped where I did, because either I didn't want to know or I'm too afraid to ask to continue the story.
And right as you said, I'm a horror guy. Literally, door of my room went. Just like that. But I thought it was shut all the way.
Oh,
Like,
you're a horror guy.
oh shit! Ian's in the hallway.
The calls are coming from inside the house, Kathe. I'm over. I'm in the other room.
We'll show you. Either our ghosts are making appearances, or all our pets are making are making appearances.
I have a question for the panel.
Throw it out there.
Have you ever felt haunted in a house that you either knew well, or did it come upon you like that? Like this moment, right, where it's like, why is my door opening? Even though I know it's the cat, but why is my door opening? What if it isn't the cat?
I would say that I've never.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Go
Jeff.
ahead. It's all right, Ian. Go.
I was just gonna. Mine's really short. I was just gonna say that I've never actually. I'm one of these people who's really, really interested in the supernatural and paranormal, and I'm very skeptical, but I'm also very open-minded. But I've also never experienced anything. So when I was a kid, I was really big into like cryptozoology and the UFO stuff, and X-Files was like my favorite TV show. I was actually involved in a big UFO case that was on Unsolved Mysteries when I was like 16. So it was they did a whole documentary about it like last year because it was like the 30th anniversary of this UFO case. So they found me because I'm one of the only people that's still around from this case. But for me, I've never actually experienced anything myself, and there's a part of me that wants to, but then there's like, oh no, it looks like it would be really awful. Why would I want to have that happen?
I'm good.
Jeff.
I get a sense from landscapes that seem sentient to me, like there's some kind of consciousness behind them. That's kind of a creepy, haunting feeling. Like I feel it out here in the farmland out here. I also felt it in Scotland. I was up in the by the Isle of Skye. Some of that old land, that land up there is so old and everything. I don't know. I get a sense of that. That's kind of a haunting. As far as haunted houses go, I'm trying to think if there's ever been one. I keep thinking this one might be because it's so old, but I haven't seen a damn ghost here. I don't think there's any here. I haven't seen one here since I've been here.
Kathe, how about you answering your own question?
And the three of them were never seen again. No, I have been in places where I was creating a show with a wonderful group of artists, a collaborative show in an old building. In fact, that used to be a movie studio in Detroit called the Jam Handy. They did a lot of work for the Defense Department and during the Second World War. And we were putting on a version of Marlowe's Faustus. And I kept seeing something out of the corner of my eye on one of the stairways in a place where we were not, that in fact led up to a residence. And finally I asked the installation artist I was working with, who was very intuitive about things like this, I said, this is wigging me out. And so she went to the stairs and said, stop it, we're working here. Just stop. And that was it. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to bring a little levity to it. Yeah.
I mean, that was it. Either because it wasn't a feeling of, oh, but it's like there's something there. I mean, I could, if it was your cat, if it was another, you see something, and then it was gone. And who knows? Maybe it was a tribute to Marlowe. And Faustus, and it was a very charged time. It was in right after the 2016 election, and we had all expected something, and we got something else, and so the energy was really fucked up that night. So maybe that had something to do with it.
I think when you look at these sort of things, it's like. I don't think a ghost would ever haunt me.
Ian, we're getting a lot of echo. Is everyone else getting some echo?
Yeah, I'm getting some echo. Not really sure why though.
Oh, okay.
Still there? No, it's fine now.
We might be having some of it. To echo you quite literally, I'm with you with the cryptozoology, and I'm with you in that I'm certainly open to it, but skeptical. So most of anything unexplained over my years that I've experienced, I'm much more interested in trying to put the Carl Sagan on it and rule it out before saying like, oh, something touched me. It's a ghost. You know, I mean, I'm much more interested from a personal perspective and from a fiction perspective in the tension between that, in the process of ruling it out, and what it says about our characters and their human stories. So, but it's
I'm always surprised by how skeptical a lot of horror writers are. Like, and I have to admit, like, I am, for someone who writes this stuff, and I write about believer characters because you kind of have to sort of often to move the story along. I feel like there's also maybe kind of a the lady doth protest too much. That maybe it's because I am afraid of something actually happening in my house, because I vividly recall I use humor as a defense mechanism all the time for that kind of stuff, because I think I started watching horror movies when I was really young, so I think I had to tell myself these things aren't real. You know, obviously, literally with movies, they're not real, but then ghosts aren't real. You know, you don't have to worry about these things. So it was very much reinforcing that. I remember going to see the very first Paranormal Activity movie in the theater and giggling as we were coming home, my wife and I, and she just turns to me, and it's like the scenes when the one character who's like possessed would be standing at the side of the bed, and then the clock would go off, and she's standing there for hours just staring at him. And my wife just said, "If you ever do that to me, you will not pass go. You will not collect $200. We will go straight to divorce." She was not joking.
This topic of real life ghost stories is
I definitely believe in all that stuff, because when I grew up, you know, my grandmother, she read the cards. She saw a banshee when she was a kid, and you know, she would tell all these stories about people, you know, back in the old times. And the woman across the street was from Ireland, and she grew up with Richard Harris, and she told the freakiest fucking ghost stories, man. I'm telling you. Like, her father's coming home one day, and he passes like a funeral procession on the road.
Uh-oh.
And he asked him, like, well, you know, whose is it? And it turned out to be this guy who took a fit and just like died of like an aneurysm or something in town. And he had no idea the guy was dead. And they told him, we're coming to get this guy, you know. And he went back and he found out that guy had, but she had a ton of these things. I mean, really weird, creepy, all from the same town she grew up in. That must be the hauntedest damn town in the world. I'm telling you.
All my mom's family is from the east coast of Canada, and it's the same thing where it's just like everyone in my mom's family, and she had 5 sisters and 6 brothers, and dozens of cousins. I got dozens of cousins. Everyone's got a ghost story out there, and they all swear it absolutely happened. So as little kids, we would hear these stories, and you would think that, oh, they shouldn't be telling these stories to these kids. I would go to my mom like, oh, you know, my cousin Sean's telling me this story about this bloody head falling off this old war tower. You know, he's scaring us. And she's like, he's just warning you. You don't want to go near that tower. And I was like,
Speaking of warnings, Kathe, you and the panel hit the zeitgeist of my transitional question, which my next transitional topic, which the story that's mentioned in Ian's collection, the house on Ashley Avenue, is a great iteration of a haunted house story, because it's definitely a haunted house story, and I'm not going to give away anything at all, but it does show the appeal of like a subcategory of that, the ghost, not per se the ghost hunter, but let's just say people adjacent to a haunted house. And it's one of the things that I really like about that particular story, is that it's a the house on Ashley Avenue is a great ghost story. It's a great haunted house story, but it's got a lot of openness and mythology around the edges. So I could see why that story has its acclaim there. But yeah, so let's throw it over to the panel. Like, what is the why are we so interested in these ghost hunters, or not even the ghost hunters as in, oh, it touched me, but what is it with these real life ghost stories, before we head on over to Jeff?
They feel true. They feel true. There's something in, whether it's metaphorically true, whether it's physically true, whatever, there's some resonance there. It's the same reason we like to hear love stories, right? It's the same, it's a bedrock human experience to feel that there is something that transcends physical immediacy, and we believe it or disbelieve it, but we can't get away from it, and we don't really want to get away from it.
There seems to be a difference between, I'm not going to go into this whole thing I did last time I was on, but there seems to be a difference between the way a ghost story is told in a ghost story collection and the way supernatural stuff happens in real life, where it doesn't add up to anything. It just happens. You see it, or you might notice it, and you're like, what the fuck? You know what I mean? What was that? And then you just go on with your life because nothing happens. But there's this crescendo in ghost stories, or this like there's this resonance between the character and the haunting and so forth. You know, the main character, the haunting, or whatever, or the history of the ghost. But in real life, strange things happen. You know, I don't know if you call them ghost stories or anything, but I mean, strange things happen, and then they just don't go anywhere. But they're so cool. And this is what I was telling Dan last time I talked to him on one of these things. It's like I was trying to capture that. Because if you capture that, I mean, you're going to capture something that's people will recognize. Oh, this is not like, you know, a 19th century ghost story with the slow creep and everything. This is something completely weird, but I recognize it because I've experienced it in life, you know?
I think, oh, go ahead, Ian.
I was just going to say, like, isn't it wild? Because you have ghost stories and film and television about the same thing, and there's always a story, there's a narrative. But you're right. In real life, if you say you watch one of these ghost reality shows, which usually nothing ever happens on them, but when it is, it's always something like it would. And ironically, this would be terrifying to me if I was standing in a room and I'm not near any fault lines, I'm not in earthquake country, and just a chair just moved 6 inches, and it's like, there's no reason. There's no breeze. There's no one in the room. There's no reason that I can think of why that should have happened. That's terrifying to me. But I mean, if I try to write a story about that, people aren't going to care, right? Because that's not a story.
That's what's so awful about films that are people confront these unbelievable monsters and ghosts, and they're able to assimilate it instantly. I too, if I see just a chair, that's going to put me out. I'm leaving. Okay.
Well, that should have been the real sequels to Poltergeist. After those little kids were all sucked into this giant wormhole, it's like those kids are messed for life. It's like you might as well just put them down the hole anyway, because what are they going to do? The PTSD is horrible.
I think there are two examples of, one is a film example and one is a literature example of getting close to what Jeff and the panel were saying about closer to the verisimilitude of less of the ghost story structure and more of portraying in a dramatic form that quote unquote verisimilitude. I knew I wouldn't get away without mentioning his name, but Robert Aikman's stories.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
They tend to do that, and particularly I'm thinking of the Swords. You know, spoilers for the Swords. I mean, it's no spoilers. I can't stop talking about it, but after the events of the Swords, Aikman just does a time travel shift in his last paragraph, and he ends it by saying, like, and the narrator often thought about what happened, but never saw anything quite like it again. It's just that one ending. It just ends like basically it ends with what trying to capture with what Jeff was saying. It's like, yeah, and his life went on, and nothing else ever became of it. And it wasn't flip, and it wasn't sarcastic. It was just. It somehow was what made it more scary and what gave it the weight and the resonance for me and the Aikman. And a great ghost or supernatural story that to riff on what Kathe was saying is it follows, right? Like the way the characters react to what's going on in that. I love those reactions because their plans are stupid. They lose it. They don't make sense of that, and it's so much more better than a signposting where it's like, yes, Jeff, you take the sword, Ian, you take the silver bullet, and Kathe, you hold his neck, and we shall solve this supernatural. It's so much better than the neat bows is when you see the characters then unravel, and right, that still might be for show and a dramatic thing, but it's much more closer to what's going to happen, like if we see the chair move, right? Maybe it'd be like we go on with our lives and we talk about it. We're drunk at a convention once, or if it's something worse, it's like we make a plan and utterly fail
Well, I'll tell you, Daniel, but I remember when I watched that movie for the first time, and I was kind of annoyed by that third act when I called like the Scooby-Doo part when they go to Frank. But then when I'm thinking, they're just kids. And the fact that they try and that they fail, it's like, one, they don't know how this entity works, much less what's going to hurt it.
Oh,
So
God, yeah.
in
Please
retrospect,
so
I was
much.
like, actually, when I watched it again, I've watched it many times since then. It
Mm.
was like, no, I like that because of that, because it doesn't work, because they thought it might work. Is actually, there's a certain, I don't want to say the banality of a supernatural occurrence, but it's just sort of like they are treating it like it's a problem that they have to solve, and they can't ask their parents, or they're afraid to ask their parents. So we have to figure it out. Like, that's why I call it like the Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, I call it the same thing. I love it so much. So,
on the flip side of that, though, I would say, like, in terms of especially in terms of the season that we're talking about, I mean, you guys have probably already discussed it before, but Lake Mungo. You know, you want to talk about a movie that really nails the supernatural occurrence, but what's really about a haunting? It's about grief. You know, it's just, that movie is as much about death and grief and acceptance and trying to move on, even though you'll always be broken, as much as it is about anything they capture on film or any of the supernatural stuff. And again, it's like the banality of a real supernatural occurrence, like a chair moving 6 inches. With the exception of the sort of the bit of a gotcha moment at the end, the stuff that they capture on film, the supernatural occurrences, are very simple. They're not like huge specters or anything really, really violent and other things. Like, it's the quiet subtlety of that movie that I think works as much as anything else that makes it such an effective film.
You know, one of the things about that, I'm sorry, one of the things about that film and a lot of ghost stories is they're a rational investigation of something that's going on. Even in ones where the characters don't have it together and all that other stuff, there's always a sense of a rational investigation happening, where you're taking somebody through the story, or they're going through the story and they're trying to find out what's going on with this ghost or whatever it is. You know, what is it, right? I mean, but the ones I'm talking about, which I did call, by the way, in the banal of the paranormal, that doesn't, there isn't an investigation. It's like it hits you, and then you're like, yeah, what the fuck am I going to do about this? Let's go, you know, I got to go to the grocery store or whatever. You don't have time for ghosts anymore these days. You don't have time.
Well, I think
the Kathe Koja stories are so great because they're, it's like you did nothing to cause this, and yet here it is, and it's so bad, and it's so much worse than you, and there's no reason for it. You're not getting comeuppance, you didn't do this, whatever. It's just sucks to be here. Now you have some extra arms, and I guess that's how it's going to be. Oh, wow. And the story's over. You're like, wow, what just happened? That's great. But that's the supernatural, even the existence of it is enough to put you out, right? Once that chair has moved, it will never unmove in your mind. You know that you saw a chair move, and that calls everything else into question.
And why do they bring in the people to investigate this with their detectors and all this stuff? It's because something has scared me in what I thought was my normal world that I lived the first 40 years of my life. I need to have that back again. I need an explanation.
Right. You know? Even though I can't, even though I'm never going to.
Yeah.
I got it.
And that's the real haunting. That will live with you for that moment on. Even if you never experience, even if that chair never moves again, it's moving over and over in your brain for the rest of your life.
It will
you
never
remember
stop.
That ghost stories incident where the ghost hunters went out on the railroad track to find where these people got hit by the train and got hit by the train? You know what I mean? And now I'm wondering if a few years from now somebody else is going to go out there. It seems like a revolving, like, you know, thing. I don't know why I brought that up.
No, it's a structure. Thank you so much for that. We could go down that rabbit hole for sure. I want to, before we move on to our next part of the show, I figured I'd take this time just to make our announcements and our plugs rather than throwing them in at the end. So we're still in the middle of night one, but announcing the second night of the festival. We're going to spreading it out over the whole winter instead of cramming it into December as I usually do. So I'm going to make a page and type it up, but hasn't been done yet, so you're the first to hear. So the next night is going to be tune in on January 12th for night 2 of the festival, and joining us will be Brian Evanson,
Cool.
Alex Jennings, and John Paget. And for more ghost stories, more wintry supernatural, and
Cool.
and ghostly discussion. So hopefully we'll see you all back here for that. We've already held this. It's so nice. We'll do it again. Let's hold up. You can get the ghost stories we're talking about tonight. This one is in. I'm having some temporal displacement. Velocities from Meerkat Press. That's Kathe Koja's latest short story collection. We talked about. We just went to my Twitter feed, but we're back to Every House. Some feedback. Every House is Haunted by Ian Rogers. It's the great Cemetery Dance cover. And we're going to hear from Jeff in a little bit. Jeff's going to be reading from one of the stories of, it can be found in The Drowned Life. I think you're reading The Bedroom Light, Jeff? Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's really close. The beginning of it's kind of close to Ian's story.
Yeah,
cool.
they have a great, all three of the stories I thought had they worked really well together. And The Bedroom Light can also be found in Inferno by Ellen Datlow. So those are great.
Daniel, don't forget your book, Daniel.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so
go.
much. I don't have it handy, so I'm the author of Underworld Dreams. And coming this spring, The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales is going to be joining the ranks with Ian's book over at Cemetery Dance. But I'd like to introduce our next guest, who needs no introduction. But Jeffrey Ford is the author of the novels The Physiogony, which I haven't read that series yet, and I bought it twice because I thought I was telling Jeff, I didn't have it. So I now have 2 different copies of it, which is great.
There you go.
The Memoranda, The Beyond, The Portrait of Mrs. Charvuc, The Girl in the Glass, The Cosmology of the Wider World, The Shadow Year, The Twilight Pariah, Ahab's Return, and Out of Body, just to talk about his novels. His short story collections are The Fantasy Writer's Assistant, The Empire of Ice Cream, The Drowned Life, which I just held up the copy of, Crackpot Palace, A Natural History of Hell, The Best of Jeffrey Ford, and his most recent is Big Dark Hole, one of my personal favorites. Ford's fiction has appeared in numerous magazines and anthologies, from Tor.com to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction to the Oxford Book of American Short Stories, and has been widely translated. It has garnered World Fantasy, Edgar Allan Poe, Shirley Jackson, Nebula Awards, and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He lives in Ohio. Welcome back. Jeff. We're going to send it over to you. You're going to be reading from The Drowned Life?
Yeah, I got to set it up here, though, because I can't see anything. It takes me a minute to get all my stuff together here. I'm sorry.
So we'll just put you on. We'll put
I'm
him
ready.
on. All right, over to you,
I
Jeff.
gotta get all my lights on.
Get the lights, camera, ghosts in position, and over to Jeff.
Yeah, it's a story, The Bedroom Light. They each decided separately that they wouldn't discuss the miscarriage that night. The autumn breeze sounded in the tree outside the open kitchen window and traveled all through the second-story apartment of the old Victorian house. It twirled the hanging plant over the sink, flapped the ancient magazine photo of Veronica Lake tacked to his office door, spun the clown mobile in the empty bedroom, and beneath it set the wicker rocker to life. In their bedroom, it tilted the fabric shade of the antique floor lamp that stood in the corner by the front window. Allison looked at the reflection of them lying beneath the covers in the mirror set into the top of the armoire, while Bill looked at their reflection in the glass of the hand-colored print Moon Over Miami that hung on the wall above her. The huge gray cat, Mama, her belly skimming the floor, padded quietly into the room and snuck through the partially open door of the armoire. Bill rolled over to face Allison and ran his hand softly down the length of her arm. Today, while I was writing, he said, I heard coming up through the grate beneath my desk Tana's mother yelling at her. Demon seed, said Allison. He laughed quietly. Yeah. He stopped rubbing her arm. I got out of my chair, got down on the floor, and turned my ear to the grate. She smiled. So the mom's telling Tana, you listen to me. I'm the mother. I'm in charge, and you'll do what I say. Then there was a pause, and I hear this voice. Man, this was like no kid's voice, but it was Tana, and she says, "No, Mommy, I'm in charge, and you will listen to me." "Get out of here," Allison said, and pushed him gently in the chest. God's honest truth. So then Cindy makes a feeble attempt to get back in power. "I'm the mommy," she yells, but I could tell she meant to say it with more force. It came out cracked and weak. And then there's a pause, and Tana comes back with, "You're wrong, Mommy. I'm in charge, and you will listen to me." "Creep show," said Allison. It got really quiet then, so I put my ear down closer. My head was on the damn floor. That's when I heard Cindy weeping. Allison gave a shiver, half fake, and handed Bill one of her pillows. He put it behind his head with the rest of his stack. "Did I tell you what Phil told me?" she said. "No," he said. "He told me that when he's walking down the street and he sees her coming toward him, he crosses over to the opposite side." "I don't blame him," he said, laughing. "He told you about the dog, right?" she said, pulling the covers up over her shoulder. Bill shook his head. "He said the people who live in the second floor apartment next door, the young guy with the limp and his wife, Rhoda, they used to have a beagle that they kept on their porch all day while they were at work. Over here," he said, and pointed at the wall. "Yeah. They gave it water and food, the whole thing, and had a long leash attached to its collar. Anyway, one day Phil's walking down to the Busy Bee to get coffee and cigarettes, and he sees Tana standing under the porch, looking up at the dog. She was talking to it. Phil said that the dog was getting worked up, so he told Tana to leave it alone. She shot him a 'don't fuck with me' stare. He was worried how it might look, him talking to the kid, so he went on his way. That afternoon, the dog was discovered strangled, hanging by its leash off the second-story porch. He never told me that shit, and come to think of it, I never told you this. I was sitting in my office just the other day writing. All of a sudden, I feel something on my back like it's tingling. I turn around, and there she is, standing in the doorway to the office, holding Mama like a baby doll, just staring at me. I jumped out of my chair, and I said, like, 'I didn't hear you knock.' I was a little scared, actually, so I asked her if she wanted a cookie. At first, she didn't say anything, but just looked at me with that. If I were writing a story about her, I'd describe her face as dour, an old lady face minus the wrinkles. Then get this, she says in that low, flat voice, 'Do you lambada?' What the fuck?" Allison said and laughed. "She didn't say that." "No," he said. "That's what she said. She asked me if I lambada. What the hell is it anyway?" I told her no, and then she turned and split. "Lambada, I think," she said, and broke out laughing again. "I think it's some kind of South American dance." "What would have happened if I said yes?" he asked. "Lambada," she whispered, shaking her head. "Phil's got the right strategy with her," he said. "But I don't like her coming up here in the middle of the day uninvited," said Allison. "I'll have to start locking the door after you go to work," said Bill. "This place, there's something very, I don't know," she sighed. "Like you ever lean against a wall? It kind of gives like flesh, almost spongy," she said. "That's just the Latin. It's separating away from the sheetrock because this building is so old. I know what you mean, though, with that eggshell smoothness and the pliancy when you touch it. Like you said, spongy weird. There's a sinister factor to this place. The oriental carpets, the lion's paw tub, the old heavy furniture, the gravity of the past that was here when we moved in. I can't put my finger on it. At first, I thought it was quaint, but then I realized it didn't stop there." "Like melancholy?" he asked. "Yeah, exactly, a sadness. Just think about it. You got Corky and Cindy down there hitting the sauce and each other almost every night. They must have had to buy a whole new set of dishes after last weekend. Then you got the kid, enough said there. What about next door on the other side, the guy who washes his underwear on the fucking clothesline with the hose? That guy's also classically deranged. I forgot about him," she said. "Well," he said, "let's not forget about him. I watch him from the kitchen window. I can see right down through the tree branches and across the yard into his dining room. He sits there every night for hours reading that big fat book. I've seen him down there," she said. "Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, go into the kitchen for a glass of water, I notice him down there reading. Is it the Bible? Could be the phone book for all I know. Cindy told me that when they got Tana, the yippy little dog, Shotzi, Potsy, whatever, the kid was walking on that side of the house over by the old guy's property, and he came out his back door and yelled at her, 'If I find your dog in my yard, I'll kill it.' Now I know Tana's demon seed and all, but she's still a little kid. Cindy didn't tell Corky because she was afraid he'd cough off and kick the crap out of the old guy. What, instead of her for once? Hey, you never know. Maybe the old man's just trying to protect himself from Tana's Animal Magic, said Bill. You know, Cindy swears the kid brought a dead bird back to life. She just kind of slips that in the middle of a, hey, the weather's nice kind of conversation. Yeah, I've caught that tale, said Allison. There was a pause. But do you get my overall point here? She opened her hands to illustrate the broadness of the concept. Like we're talking some kind of hovering negative funk. Amorphous and pungent, he said. I felt it ever since the first week we moved in. Does it have anything to do with the old woman who answered the door with her pants around her ankles? He asked. Olive Hawker, she said, Corky's illustrious mom. Remember, Olive had to get shipped out for us to move in. Maybe she cursed the joint, put the lambada on it. It wasn't her so much, said Allison. I first felt it the day the cat pissed in the sugar bowl. Right in front of me, between bites of French toast. He said, that cat sucks. Don't talk about Mama that way, she said. It bars like a lamb. It eats flies. I hate it, he said. She's good. 3 whole weeks gone and she still came back, didn't she? You shouldn't have thrown her out. I didn't throw her. I drop kicked her. She made a perfect arc right over the back fence. But the question is, or at least the point is, if I follow you, how strange it is that she pissed right in the sugar bowl, jumped up on the table, made a beeline for it, parked right over it, and pissed like there was no tomorrow. That's what I'm getting at, said Allison. It fulfills no evolutionary need. It's just grim. Maybe it's us, he said. Maybe we're haunting ourselves. I saw Corky digging a big hole out in the yard the other day, she said. His back's full of ink, an angel being torn apart by demons. I was more interested in the hole he was digging because I haven't heard any yipping at a potsy for a few days. Don't worry, he said. I'm ready for him. How, she asked. The other day when I went out garbage picking, I found a busted off rake handle. I wound duct tape around one end for a grip. It's in the kitchen behind the door for when Corky gets shit-faced, starts up the stairs. Then I'm going to grab that thing and beat his ass. Hey, do you remember that guy Keith back in college, she asked? McCurley? Yeah, he said. He did the apple dance. What made you think of him? She nodded. Every time he flapped his arms, the apple rolled off his head, remember? He danced to Steve Miller's Fly Like an Eagle, Bill said. What a fucking fruitcake. I remember O'Shea telling me that he ended up working for the government. Well, remember that time he was telling us he was reading the Amityville Horror? Yeah, he said. McCurley said that one of the pieces of proof that the author used in the book to nail down his case that the house was really haunted was that they found an evil shit in the toilet bowl. Remember that? Yeah, you said to him, what do you mean by an evil shit? And McCurley looked like he didn't get your question. But what he eventually said was, it was heinous. I asked if he could explain that, and he said, really gross. They laughed. She touched his face as if to make him quiet and said, that's the point. We paint the unknown with the devil's shit to make it make sense. Heavy, said Bill. A few seconds passed in silence. Right, she said. Amityville was only 2 towns over from where I grew up, he told her. Never knew people were in there, and it was all fixed up. I'd go out drinking with my friends all night, the Callahans and Wolfie and Angelo and Benny the Bear. And at the end of the night, we'd have these cases of empty beer bottles in the car. So around that time, the movie came out. We went to see it and laughed our asses off. Come on. James Brolin, Steiger, we're talking. One of the things that cracked us up big time was the voice saying, get out. For God's sake, get out. Steiger and the Flies, baby, well worth the price of admission. So we decided we're going to drive to Amityville Horror House and scream, get the hell out. Throw the empties on the lawn. That's stupid, she said. We did it, but then we kept doing it, not just to the Amityville Horror House. Every time we did it, I'd crack like hell. It was so fucking stupid, it made me laugh. Plus, we were high as kites and did it to people we knew and didn't know, and we did it to a lot of the high school coaches we'd had for different sports. There was this one guy, though, we did it to the most, Coach Pinhead. Crew cut, face as smooth as an ass, googly eyes, and his favorite joke was to say, how long is a Chinaman? He was a soccer coach, a real douchebag, but we swung by his house every weekend night for like 3 months, dropped the empties and yelled Pinhead before peeling out on his lawn. We called the whole thing a piercing pinhead. Could you imagine how pissed off you'd be today if some kids did that to you? She said. Yeah, he said, I know. But get this, I was talking to Mike Callahan about 5 years ago when he was working selling furniture and married to that rich girl. I saw him at my mother's funeral. He told me that he found out that Pinhead died of pancreatic cancer. All that time we were doing the piercing pinheads, screaming in the middle of the night outside his house, tormenting him. The poor guy was in there in his bedroom. dying by inches. That's haunted, said Allison. Tell me about it, he said, and then rolled closer to kiss her. They kissed and lay quiet, both listening to the sound of the leaves. Hold on one sec. That's haunted, said Allison. Tell me about it, he said, and then rolled closer to kiss her. They kissed and then lay quiet, both listening to the sound of the leaves blowing outside. She began to doze off, but before her eyes closed all the way, she said, "Who's getting the light?" "You," said Bill. "Come on," she said. "I got an early shift tomorrow. Come on. I got the damn light every night for the past 2 weeks." "That's 'cause it's your job," she said. "Fuck that," he said, but started to get up, and then the light went out. She opened her eyes, slightly grinning. "Sometimes it pays to be haunted," she said. Bill looked around the darkened room and said, as if to everywhere at once, "Thank you." The light blinked on and then off. "Maybe the bulb's loose," he said. The light blinked repeatedly on and off and then died again. "That's freaky," she said, but freaky wasn't going to stop her from falling asleep. Her eyes slowly closed, and before he could kiss her again on the forehead, she was lightly snoring. Bill lay there in the dark, wide awake, thinking about their conversation, about the lamp. He thought about ghosts in Miami beneath swaying palm trees, doing the lambada by moonlight. Finally, he whispered, "Light, are you really haunted?" Nothing. A long time passed, and then he asked, "Are you Olive?" The light stayed off. "Are you Pinhead?" "Just darkness." "Are you Tana?" he said. He waited for a sign, but nothing. Eventually, he closed his eyes and thought about work. He worked at Neskron, a used bookstore housed in the bottom floor of a block-long 4-story warehouse, timbers and stone, built in the 1800s. The owner, Stan, had started decades earlier in the scrap paper business and over time had amassed tons of old books. The upper 3 floors of the warehouse were packed with unopened boxes and crates from all over the world. Bill's job was to crawl in amid the piles of boxes, slit them open, and mine their cargo, picking out volumes for the literature section in the store downstairs. Days would pass at work and he'd see no one. He'd penetrated so deeply into the morass of the 3rd floor that sometimes he'd get scared, having the same feeling he'd had when he and Allison had gone to Montana 3 months earlier to recuperate, and they were way up in the mountains and came upon a freshly killed and half-eaten antelope beside a waterhole. Amid the piles of books, he felt for the second time in his life that he was really out there. "I expect some day to find a pine box up on the 3rd floor holding the corpse of Henry Miller," he told Allison at dinner one night. "Who's Henry Miller?" she asked. He'd found troves of classics and first editions and even signed volumes for the store down below, and Stan had praised his efforts at excavating the upper floors. As the months went on, Bill was making a neat little stack of goodies for himself, planning to shove them in a paper sack and spirit them home with him when he closed up some Monday night. An early edition of Longfellow's translation of Dante, an actual illuminated manuscript with gold leaf, a signed first edition of Call of the Wild, and an 1885 edition of The Scarlet Letter were just some of the treasures. Recently at work, he'd begun to get an odd feeling when he was deep within the wilderness of books. Not the usual fear of loneliness, but the opposite, that he wasn't alone. Twice in the last week, he thought he'd heard whispering, and once the sudden quiet tumult of a distant avalanche of books. He'd asked down below in the store if anyone else was working the 3rd floor, and he was told that he was the only one. Then only the previous day, he couldn't locate his cache of hoarded books. It was possible that he was disoriented, but in the very spot he thought they'd be, he instead found one tall, slim volume. It was a book of fairy tales illustrated by an artist named Seeger. The animals depicted in the illustrations walked upright, had distinct personalities, and the children in powder blue snowscapes, surrounded by Christmas mice, were pale, staring zombies. The colors were odd, slightly washed out, and the sizes of the creatures and people were haphazard. Without realizing it, Bill fell asleep, and his thoughts of work melted into a dream of the writer Henry Miller. He woke suddenly a little while later to the sound of Allison's voice, the room in darkness. "Bill," she said again, and pushed his shoulder. "You awake?" "Yeah," he said. "I had a dream," said Allison. "Oh, my God." "Sounds like a good one," he said. Maybe, she said. He could tell she was waiting for him to ask what it was about. Finally, he asked her, "So what happened?" She drew close to him, and he put his arm around her. She whispered, "Lothian." "Lothian," said Bill. "A woman with 3 arms," said Allison. "She had an arm coming up out of the upper part of her back and a hand on it, and the hand on it had two thumbs instead of a pinky and a thumb, so it wouldn't be either righty or lefty. The elbow only bent up and down, not side by side, not side to side. Yow, said Bill. Her complexion was light blue and her hair was dark and wild but not long, and she wore this dress with an extra armhole in the back. This dress was plain, like something out of the Dust Bowl, gray, and reached to the ankles. And I remembered my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Donnelly, the mean old bitch, having worn the exact one back in grade school when she spent a whole year reading. When we spent a whole year reading The Last Days of Pompeii. Did the three-armed woman look like your teacher? Asked Bill. No, but she was stupid and mean like her. She had a dour face, familiar and frightening. Anyway, Lothian wandered the woods with a pet jay that flew above her, sometimes perched in her tangled hair. I think she might have been a cannibal. She lived underground in like a woman-sized rabbit warren. Charming, he said. I was a little girl, and my sister and I were running hard toward this house in the distance, away from the woods, just in front of a wave of nighttime. I knew we had to reach the house before the darkness swept over us. The blue jay swooped down, and as I tried to catch my breath, it spit into my mouth. It tasted like fire and spread to my arms and legs. My running went dream slow, my legs dream heavy. My sister screamed toward the house. Then, like a rusty engine, I seized altogether and fell over. You know, in China, they eat bird spit soup, he said. Shut up, she said. The next thing I know, I come to, and Lothian and I are on a raft in a swiftly moving stream, tethered to a giant willow tree that's growing right in the middle of the flow. Lothian has a lantern in one hand, and in the other she's holding the end of a long vine that's tied in a noose around my neck. The moon's out, shining through the willow whips and reflecting off the running water, and I'm so scared. She says, time to practice drowning, kicks me in the back. I fall into the water under the surface. I'm looking up, and moonlight allows me to see the stones and plants around me. There are speckled fish swimming by. Just before I'm out of air, she reels me in. This happens 3 times, and on the last time, when she reels me in, she vanishes, and I'm flying above the stream, surrounding hills and woods, and I'm watching things growing. Huge plants like asparagus, sprouting leaves, twining and twirling and growing in the moonlight. Even in the dark, it was so perfectly clear. Geez, said Bill. Allison was silent for a while. Eventually, she propped herself up on her elbow and said, it was frightening, but it struck me as a creative dream because of the end. A 3-armed woman, said Bill. Rembrandt once did an etching of a 3-armed woman having sex with a guy. I was wondering if the noose around my neck was symbolic of an umbilical cord. He stared at her. Why? He finally said. She was about to answer, but the bedroom light blinked on and off, on and off, on and off, without stopping, like a strobe light, and from somewhere or everywhere in the room came the sound of low moaning. Bill threw the covers off, sat straight up and said, what the fuck? Allison, wide-eyed, her glance darting here and there, said, Bill. The light show finally ended in darkness, but the sound grew louder, more strange, like a high-pitched growling that seemed to make the window panes vibrate. She grabbed his shoulder and pointed to the armoire. He turned, and as he did, Mama the cat came bursting out of the standing closet, the door swinging wildly. She screeched and spun in incredibly fast circles on the rug next to the bed. Jesus Christ, yelled Bill, and lifted his feet, afraid the cat might claw. Get the fuck out of here. He yelled at it. Mama took off out the bedroom, still screeching. Allison jumped out of the bed, took off after the cat. Bill cautiously brought up the rear. They found Mama in the bathroom on the floor next to the lion paw tub, writhing. Look, said Bill, peering over Allison's shoulder. She's attacking her own ass. What the hell? Oh, man, said Allison. Check it out. She pointed as Mama pulled a long, furry lump out of herself with her teeth. That's it for me, he said, backing away from the bathroom doorway. Bill, here comes another. It's alive. Alive, he said, sitting down on a chair in the kitchen. I thought it was a mohair turd. No, you ass. She's having a kitten. I never realized she was pregnant. Must be from the time you kicked her out. Bill sat there staring at Allison's figure illuminated by the bulb she'd switched on in the bathroom. This is amazing. You should come see it, she called over her shoulder to him. I'll pass, he said. He turned then and looked through the open kitchen window down across the yard toward the old man's house. For the first time he could remember, his neighbor wasn't there reading the big book. The usual rectangle of light was now a dark, empty space. Later he found Allison sitting in the wicker rocker beneath the clown mobile in the otherwise empty bedroom. The light was on, and she rocked slowly, a rolled-up towel cradled in her arms. Come see, she said to him, smiling. The first was stillborn. This is the only other one, but it lived. It's a girl. He didn't want to, but she seemed so pleased. He took a step closer. She pulled back a corner of the towel, and there was a small, wet face with blue eyes. Now we have to name it, she said. Thanks. Sorry, that went on longer than I thought it was gonna. My apologies.
Oh, no, not at all, Jeff. Not at all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was, I'm hearing some echo. I'm going to check to see where that's coming from. I'm like everyone's uncle, senile uncle, that I say the same story probably year after year, but this next little anecdote does relate to Jeff's story and the next question for Jeff and the panel. It's an anecdote about something Tim Powers once said. He was guest of honor at a convention probably 20 some odd years ago. And he was talking about, sadly, a factory of chickens raised for slaughter. And they were living in this warehouse and they'd never seen the sun. So it's a warehouse that is completely blocked out. There's no sun. And for some reason, some researchers decided to make a silhouette of a hawk, a chicken hawk, predator of chickens. And these chickens, generations upon generations of them, had lived in captivity. They'd never seen the sun. They'd never seen another animal. Horrible, but this was the anecdote. And these researchers put the silhouette of the chicken hawk on a line, and they ran it across the top of the factory and just caused mass chaos in the factory. All the chickens went nuts. And Tim said, the reason I'm telling you this story is that is how I see the job of the fiction writer, to summon something in you. I don't think you used the word instinctual, but to summon something, to touch something in you that maybe you never even thought about, maybe you never even knew, but it's built in. And I was thinking about that story, one, because I can't stop thinking about Tim Powers and Robert Aikman, but two, another aptly named Jeff Ford anecdote. This one was Jeff, you called it the metaphysics of fiction writing, a little essay in the end of The Drowned Life. And to long story short, you end in the nutshell of saying what we write must be intuitive and not intellectual. And I immediately thought of the Tim Powers and the chicken hawk story. So question to you, Jeff, and then we'll wrap it up by throwing it over to the panel, is, so what is it about ghost stories that is even more intuitive? What is it about ghost stories that makes us like those chickens reacting to the chicken hawk, to use Tim Powers' example?
I'll tell you, that chicken hawk story reminds me of Plato's cave.
Yeah, probably. Knowing Tim, he probably was riffing on it for sure.
I don't know what makes stories what makes them intuitive. I mean, it depends on what kind of writer you are. Every story is intuitive to me. I mean, I never know where they're going. I don't even want to know where they're going. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I love the discovery of it. So if you have that feeling when you're writing it and you're discovering the story as you go along, you're going to capture that feeling, and the reader's going to feel that excitement too, as you go. I mean, I'm not a big planner. I don't take notes. I don't make any kind of actually, I don't take any notes. I don't give a damn about the notes. If I don't remember it, I figure it's not worth it. And then I'll come up with something better the next day. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that always works, but that's the way I feel. So, anti-intellectual, I don't mean that as a thing where, you can't be smart about it or writers aren't smart. But what I mean is that if you do let go of your inhibitions, I always say that um, it's counterintuitive because people, when they write a story, want to exert more control over it, like to grab the wheel and like make sure they know every move they're making is the right move. But what you really have to do is let go of the wheel and let the story take you. And if you can do that, all that stuff that people put in stories that used to be, when your lit teacher used to talk about symbolism and leitmotifs and all that crap, they'll already be in there.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to tweak things at the end a little bit, but that stuff will all be included. And you don't really have to intellectualize about it. A lot of times intellectualizing about it kills it. You know what I mean? It makes you move the characters in certain ways that they may not, that's not, maybe not what they want to do. You're trying to control everything in it. I don't like that kind of approach, but I know there's people that do.
Yeah, I think that's cool. The best way to. I've heard that in more than one place, and I do agree with it. I think that the people hear time and time again, what's the best way to get it to write to theme? What's the best way to get that symbolism in there? And time again, you hear what you say, Jeff, is to take your hands off the wheel and it's give it over to trust that it will be in there.
Well, people forget that stories are not about ideas; they're about things happening. Mm-hmm. Stories are about what happens and what happens next, and that's what it's about. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And in the course of that, ideas may come from that, or cool ideas and stuff may come from it. But what your job is to tell what happened and what happened next. Describe the scene, talk about the characters and what they're doing at any given time. But a lot of people think that it's all about big ideas, but it really isn't. It never pays to be too smart as a fiction writer. Or
sometimes the big ideas, I mean, now I'm just curious, I won't get a chance to interview him, but I don't know now, speaking of big ideas, I'm just thinking about Fritz Leiber's The Smoke Ghost. I mean, right? Like I have no idea about his creative process. I'm so curious now. I'm like, well, what ghost stories have big ideas? And yeah, maybe when you're just being true to yourself and true to the story, the big ideas come, right? Like even if it's not a big idea to you, it's a true idea. Who knows what Leiber was thinking when he wrote The Smoke Ghost, but the theme and the symbolism is there. Who knows? There could be a piece of paper in his papers that says symbol number 1, right? It could be. It's just I think the end of the day is does it it can't feel like, if it feels like what you said, if it feel like we were talking about this at the sound check, Jeff, right? There are some authors that we know and love whose work feels just so organic and you believe it, but we know from listening to them how not organic their process is. But at the end of the day, right, it just has to connect to that lizard brain in ourselves that is feeling something from the ghost story. What do you think, Ian?
Well, there's nothing worse than having a feeling about a story that someone else tells you is wrong because you just didn't get it, right? So it's like, well, I'm not a total idiot. Maybe I just didn't like the story or I didn't connect with the story. But I mean, my wife is an English major and she was basically ruined for short fiction because she analyzed it to death. So she said that she had to recover from that experience and come to like short fiction again because she spent so much time dissecting it. So it's something that I like literary analysis, but at the same time, as someone who writes, I want to tell a good story, and I think like what Jeff was saying with writing intuitively, you want to make sure that it's about this thing happened, and then something happened next, like you said, and those things that people might take away from it, whether they're there or not, they kind of have to lurk beneath the surface because you're writing a story. You're not writing like a term paper or a textbook on psychology or something. It was something that I believe Peter Straub once said was that if you enjoy my work, that's great, and if you see all these things in it, that's great. But I'm a storyteller. This is why I told that story. So, which was funny for someone like him because he was someone where I think we could all agree there's a lot of depth in his work, but it was something that really showed you what a humble and down to earth kind of a guy that he was that at the end of the day, he was about the story, and that was something that was really resonating with me.
Both analysis and writing stories, they're both legitimate pursuits, but they're different. to me, they're different. I mean, they're completely different. You know what I mean?
And the reader's role is crucial.
Yeah.
The story is not being told in a vacuum. It's a conversation. And without a reader, the story is inert. So what they are bringing to it is at least half of what is there.
And that really does bring the conversation full up. We have our pets are starting to weigh in.
He is throwing a fit in the hall.
Well, we're getting near the end, Kathe, because we end where we begin with how you started off by saying it is those rhythms, it is the music of the poetry, it is those velocities that are able to make the metaphysics that go from writer to page to reader. And I don't know, I love talking about it. I love trying to make it happen, but it's all magic to me. Before we wrap it up, if the three guests stay with us after we roll the closing credits, if I'm able to do it, but I just want to end it on a note. I'm really glad, Jeff, that you mentioned Lucius Shepard. We could talk about Lucius Shepard till the cows come home, and Ian, I'm glad that you did mention Peter Straub. It was a big loss for everyone. So, Peter never got to be part, of the Ghost Story Festival. But we all remember Peter as a seminal ghost story, and what a great friend to readers and writers he was. And it's an absence, and ghost stories are about absences. So, thank you for sharing this night with us. To everyone out there tuning in. Thanks to Kathe, to Ian, and Jeff. It was great.
I'm thrilled to read with Kathe and Ian. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, your stories. You are all three such great writers, such great readers, and your stories. You didn't plan it. They just worked really well together, making my job really easy. So
the rocking chairs.
And I gotta say, when Jeff read and Kathe read, the stories were different, but I was just drawn in both of them. Like there was it was the job interview, and then with these people here, it was just it was like they were telling the story, like they were part of the story. And I was just hearing something that happened to them and their friends. So both you guys are incredible writers and incredible readers. So enrapturing,
Thank you so much to you three. Have a great December season. Stay warm, stay inspired, and we'll see you next time. Stay with us as I roll the credits.